So thank you all so much for being here. My name is Kylie McLean. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a postdoc with the Policy Impact Project, and I'll share a little bit more about that. But today's webinar is called Understanding the News: What Disability Advocates Should Know About the Potential Impacts of Health and Education Policy Changes to the Federal Government. Once again, this session is hosted by the Policy Impact Project. Oh, do you mind giving me sharing capabilities? Fabulous. Just a little bit about the Policy Impact Project. On the right, you'll see the different members of our team. We have Kyle and Ann with us here, our leaders. We are a venture of the larger Policy and Analytics Center at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute, and our goal is to use research findings to propel systems-level policy solutions that improve the lives of autistic people and others with developmental disabilities by really facilitating that translation piece. Our goal is to share knowledge effectively, inform decision makers, engage with peers, and advance research progress through translation. Here are a couple of the different areas that we focus on. I'll give you a moment to look at those. And of course, today we're talking about healthcare and education. You can check us out at our website, thepolicyimpactproject.org. We have a number of different pieces on there and blog posts. We have policy briefs. I also would encourage you to check out our Instagram, our Twitter, and our Blue Sky, because we engage on all of those different platforms to try to reach as many people as we can. So, just a little bit about why we decided to hold this webinar. We put it together because we know how overwhelming it can be to keep up with rapidly shifting policies, especially when those policies directly impact people with disabilities, their families, and their communities. With changes unfolding at the federal level, we want to help break down the key issues in health and education policy, provide some context for what these shifts could mean in practice, and most importantly, explore some concrete ways that disability advocates can engage and take action. So we are joined by two incredible experts today, Ari and Joanne, who will share their insights on how to make sense of the news, what's happening in policy right now, and how to respond effectively. We'll move through a set of guiding questions to structure our discussion, but we also want to make sure your voices are part of this conversation, so we'll save time for audience Q&A at the end. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time. We have a couple of team members who will be compiling them throughout the session, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can towards the end. So let's get started. I've grouped the questions into some broad themes, and we'll start with kind of setting the stage and making sense of the news. So our first question, and either of you are welcome to start, if you could just give a brief introduction, how you're feeling about the current landscape and how you personally make sense of the news while maintaining your well-being.
Well, I'll kick things off. Hi, my name is Ari Naaman. I'm an assistant professor of health policy and management at the Harvard School of Public Health. I previously, before entering academia, served as executive director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and as a member of the National Council on Disability during the Obama administration. How are we feeling about the current landscape? I would say, deep concern. The framing of this webinar, and a lot of the networks that people attending it have been pulled from, may come from the world of autism. But in truth, there are almost no federal funding streams or state funding streams that impact autistic people that are specific to autistic people. In general, whenever we talk about autism services, we're almost always talking about disability services. And this is a very frightening time for disability service provision. The vast majority of publicly funded service provision to people with developmental disabilities comes from the Medicaid program. There are active conversations underway right now in Congress around making hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to Medicaid. The specifics of that we'll talk about later in this webinar, but that poses very serious threats to people with disabilities of all kinds, including autistic people. the educational supports that autistic students depend on in school and legal rights that have given autistic people, like many other people with disabilities, access to the public school system, are largely administered through the Department of Education, in which there is a very active and aggressive effort underway to deconstruct. And the legal rights to non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation that autistic people frequently make use of and that we've fought for decades at this point to ensure autistic people have access to come from the broader structure of disability rights law. And as we speak, the cornerstone of disability rights law, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, is subject to a really unconscionable, attempt to declare it unconstitutional by 17 state attorney generals who have challenged both recent regulations articulating the obligations of Section 504, disability discrimination obligations in healthcare, child welfare, long-term services and supports, and a variety of other settings. They're trying to eliminate those new regulations, but they're also proposing that the underlying Section 504 statute is unconstitutional as well. So we are in the midst of really a full-throated attack on some of the programs and legal rights that people with disabilities hold most dear. While that attack is, in many respects, different and is not precisely the same or pursued with the same level of intensity that attacks on other communities are receiving right now. And I do think, we can talk a little bit about some of those differences over the course of this webinar. It is very concerning. Ultimately, in terms of how we deal with that, I think we have to focus in on the things we have the ability to influence. And as we'll talk about, there are some tremendous opportunities to have an influence, even in these very trying times.
All right, so my turn next. I'm Joanne Youngke. I'm an advocacy specialist at Disability Rights Wisconsin in Madison, and I'm also a parent of a newly minted educator, a 23-year-old who has just received and accepted a job offer for her first position teaching eighth grade English language arts, and a 20-year-old daughter as well who is working at her first job now at a conference center on the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. And my younger daughter is autistic and has a very complex IEP that she will soon be shaking off as she moves into the adult system after this semester. So I come to this conversation both as a professional and as a parent. And I appreciate the congratulations to the new teacher. And I'm so proud of both of my daughters right now. It's really an exciting time in our family. So how I'm feeling about it are feeling concerned, but on the other hand, I'm also feeling very determined, and looking forward to taking advantage of the opportunities. Part of the concern, Ari did such a nice job of the sort of the broad concern. I'm going to speak a little bit just personally, is that my organization is 90% funded by federal grants. Disability Rights Wisconsin, the protection and advocacy partners or counterparts in each state. Similarly, our funding stream was turned off for a day on January 28th, when the pause that was then reversed in most cases. So that's on the line very specifically. Also, with my daughter moving into the adult system, we're trying to do a budget amendment for her long-term supports, since she will need more of them when the school's not taking up the time. This is a heck of a time to be doing that. So yeah, the impacts are they're mostly in the future right now, but they are very real. Just in terms of personally making sense of the news. So I've got, again, both the professional hat and the personal hat. And, honestly, I'm not entirely sure I've got the balance right for myself as far as making sense of the world goes. There's I've seen a meme go around on Facebook that, my desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. That's, that's been true for a while. It's more true now than ever. But for me, I feel like knowledge is power. Knowing is better than not knowing for me. And so I probably spend more time than I should on Facebook and Blue Sky just trying to keep on top of things and make sense of the world. But I've moved the Facebook and Blue Sky apps so they're not on my home phone screen, and trying to make the balance of that, and just also the relying on personal relationships to stay grounded. My husband, my friends, my church community is very important to me for staying grounded. My fellow workers, the determination level at Disability Rights Wisconsin is like off the charts right now. We're primed for this. Even with the threat of the existential threat for our organization, it's like let's go. So there we are.
Thank you both so much. I appreciate your honesty and also the nod to that we're all determined and there are ways that we can continue to make an impact. So with that, I think we should kind of dive into some of the meat of what's going on. So the second part is what is happening and what does it all mean? So if you could provide just a brief synopsis on what's happening either in health and or education, how you think these big issues are affecting people with disabilities in your communities.
So, Ari and I want to make sure that we're sort of on the same page here. My focus is going to be education, and so does it make sense if I speak to education and you're speaking a little bit more to the Medicaid and health? I know there's some overlap. That's fair?
That sounds
Okay.
perfect. Go for it.
Okay. All right. And Ari referred to, oh goodness, the big thing that's on tap for today is that it's been announced that President Trump is going to be signing an executive order for the dismantling of the Department of Education. This was a campaign promise. It's also something that technically can truly only happen through through an act of Congress, because Congress was the entity where the Department of Education was created. That's you got to go through that to take it apart. However, the taking apart has already started in several ways. So I want to refer to just a little bit of sort of umbrella, sort of a cycle that has been happening on many fronts, at least. And it was part of what happened when the funding spigots for federal grants across the board were turned off for a day. Then there was a legal challenge, and then that's still churning. Okay, that legal challenge is still churning, but by the end of the day, most of the spigots were back on, including my workplace. But this is happening again and again as the administration, tries something that's never been tried, that's got unconstitutional written all over it. A legal challenge happens to it, and then maybe you're in the status of a temporary restraining order, and the administration is coming back to challenge again, and we've got just all of these legal cycles going and going. So with the Department of Education, obviously I don't know what's in today's announcement or in today's executive order, unless it's happened while we're talking here. I haven't seen it. So, but there have been a couple of pieces that have already been working to destabilize and take apart the Department of Education. One of those things has been the Office of Civil Rights. which is the entity within the Department of Education that enforces Section 504 when it comes to education, but also the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, the various broadly written civil rights laws in the education realm. And so the Office of Civil Rights immediately stopped working on complaints that come from families and and students and whatever. And there was a large backlog at that point. Many of them disability related and intersectional, disability and race, disability and Title IX discrimination against girls, women. So that pause lasted for about a month. And then there was sort of a quiet, okay, we'll work on the disability related ones still, but nothing to do with race and gender. And they didn't announce this publicly, but this sort of came out from behind the scenes and some very good news investigative journalism from ProPublica, which is one of my go-to sources now for what's happening. And so yes, if it's just disability related, you can start working on those again. But then, so then there was a lawsuit, and now I don't believe there's been a determination in that lawsuit. I don't think there's a temporary restraining order there yet, but that's been asked for. And then a couple of weeks later. So just recently, there in the news then big layoffs at their big reduction in force at the Department of Education, and the Office of Civil Rights. It fell very heavily on the Office of Civil Rights, such that it was about half of the staff. And over half of the regional centers that serve that serve the investigative function for the Office for Civil Rights. So Wisconsin, assuming this stands, will have lost our regional center in Chicago, and the nearest one will be Kansas City. Now there has been a lawsuit challenging that, and so that is sort of sitting in process. But in the meantime, now comes today's announcement of the executive order that is pretty certain to be unconstitutional in a number of ways, or at least challengeable on constitutional grounds. And so there's going to be a lawsuit about that. In the meantime, all this damage happens, or things sit undone. And so, so I have been, right up until we heard about the pause in the Office of Civil Rights. This was something that I would, it was part of my regular practice at Disability Rights Wisconsin was directing people to make civil rights complaints for disability related discrimination, and that tool is currently off the table for us. And the state does not have the capacity, does not have anything set up to take over those complaints. So that's something that is, that's something that's happening. It is happening right now, at least in terms of complaints that aren't being filed, but complaints that had been filed that aren't getting worked on. Now, the larger picture around the dismantling of the Department of Education. Again, we don't know what's in that executive order, but there have been bills introduced at the federal level for the dismantling of the Department of Education, and some of the things that were in those bills involved parceling out the functions. So the Office of Civil Rights would go to the Department of Justice, and the IDEA, I believe, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, funding, administration, et cetera. I believe that was the idea was to send that to the Department of Health Services. So there's something of a blueprint there. But the fact that it's not happening through congressional means that it is at the very minimum highly unorthodox. At as I said before, quite likely flagrantly unconstitutional. So it's very hard to know what's going to happen from here. I mean, the funding for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act from the federal level, while it has never approached the initially promised 40% of funding, you know, 10 to 15% or wherever it still falls right now is a big chunk of change, and our students rely on that. And our schools rely on that. And depending on what state you're in, education, special education, or the what it takes to receive that free, appropriate public education for students with disabilities, is severely underfunded in many states. And then if I could just sort of tag on one more sort of threat here, that's again sort of the threat and the promise, campaign promise, is the privatization of public education, which has been a nationwide goal and part of the Trump administration's promise that would allow private entities to benefit from all of that lovely taxpayer money that we're currently that has been a promise to our students in the public schools. What's happened in the states where vouchers, the privatization mechanism in most states that have undertaken this, vouchers are they've found ways to send the money to private schools without the constraints of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So students with disabilities do not have the promises, the protections. What ends up happening is that if these schools take students with disabilities, it's the students who are lesser impacted, and it's kind of up to the whims of the school whether or not they do get what would qualify as a free, appropriate public education in the public schools. So it's a rough landscape. It's a very rough landscape. But I do appreciate the legal pushback. That I think is on the macro level is going to be a key tool, and then we can talk about micro level or individual. What can I, person X, do a little bit later down the course.
Thank you so much for that, Joanne. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implications of the current moment for health policy. And by health policy, I include within that what we refer to as long-term services and supports, including home and community-based services, the services that make it possible for people with disabilities to survive and thrive in the community. So, we don't always think of those things as about health. In many respects, they're not about health, but they are funded through our healthcare system. And so they're very much impacted by these conversations. Now, the primary financing vehicle for both healthcare and home and community-based services for people with disabilities is the Medicaid program. And Medicaid operates on a state-federal partnership basis. Essentially, the federal government commits to matching, and in some cases more than matching, the amount of money spent by states in their Medicaid program on at least a one-to-one basis. Whereas states administer their Medicaid program and make decisions within broad federal rules about how to operate it, the federal government finances at least half of every dollar spent in Medicaid. And this kind of open-ended match has been really important for people with disabilities. When the home and community-based service system was really beginning to take shape in the 1980s and 90s, the federal match for HCBS was really crucial in incentivizing states to expand access to HCBS. Even today, as there are hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities waiting on waiting lists to access HCBS, it's home and community-based services, the existence of this match from the federal government has been really crucial in incentivizing states to reduce those waiting lists, to grow the number of people with access to HCBS, and even in the general medical care space, to equip states to respond effectively to health crises like the COVID-19 public health emergency, or to opportunities like new pharmaceuticals such as Sovaldi for hepatitis or Trikafta for cystic fibrosis. Now, unfortunately, there have been long-standing efforts to try and limit the federal government's commitment to the Medicaid program. In the first Trump administration, there was a proposal called per capita caps, which would have really capped the amount of money that the federal government would offer to states based on the number of individuals who were enrolled in their program. And so would have limited states' abilities to expand services or do things like take people off of waiting lists in order to fund HCBS or respond to health crises or opportunities that increase the cost of care. Now, that was successfully beaten back in large part thanks to the disability community's really extraordinary mobilization and advocacy to push back on efforts to cut hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid. Now, today, we are seeing once again proposals to slash large numbers of large amounts of funding from the Medicaid program. The discussions are a little bit different. Most of what we've heard on the Hill is that the per capita cap proposal, to just flat out cap the amount of money that states would receive from the federal government for their Medicaid populations per enrollee is not on the table, but other proposed cuts are, and many of them are very concerning. The Affordable Care Act created a new eligibility pathway to access Medicaid, called Medicaid expansion. And most of the country has expanded Medicaid using this eligibility pathway, in large part because the financing terms for Medicaid expansion were relatively generous. Federal government picked up most of the cost of Medicaid expansion, which made it relatively straightforward for states to expand health insurance coverage to uh, large numbers of people. Um, you will often hear from Republicans on Capitol Hill that this Medicaid expansion primarily benefited the non-disabled. That's not really true. Um, what they mean by that, it's sort of taking the most good faith possible presentation of that particular rhetoric, is that people who were on SSI, supplemental security income, by and large, already had access to Medicaid prior to Medicaid expansion. But as most of the people on this call are very aware, not all disabled people are on SSI. And in fact, there are a great number of disabled people, who either because, they are able to work or they're not able to make it through the SSI application process, either because of administrative burden or because of severity of impairment, don't receive supplemental security income benefits and thus don't qualify for Medicaid via the SSI pathway. And so for many of those people, and that includes a lot of autistic people, includes a lot of people with serious mental illness, includes a lot of people with a wide variety of other disabilities, Medicaid expansion was a really important expansion in health insurance coverage that provided people with access to really vital care. Um, there are proposals right now to dramatically cut the federal government's commitment to Medicaid expansion and to change the financing terms of Medicaid expansion in a way that many state governments, when they passed Medicaid expansion in the first place, put into their laws that if these financing terms were changed, expansion would automatically be repealed. And this would manifest in the form of a large-scale cut to the federal government's investment in Medicaid, which would have consequences across the board. If states chose not to repeal Medicaid expansion, they would need to make cuts elsewhere, potentially including home and community-based services, as well as in other investments like education, and a whole host of other priorities. Um, if they did choose to roll back Medicaid expansion as a result of these cuts, as at least some states most likely will, that would have really grave harms to people with disabilities, because many people with disabilities have benefited from Medicaid expansion. I think it's just really important to reiterate that there is this ongoing effort to try and frame Medicaid cuts as really only being about the non-disabled. And it's just not true. Fundamentally, disabled people have really heavily benefited from Medicaid expansion and stand to lose a lot, both because of direct effects and because of indirect effects as states try and make up those cuts elsewhere, if the Medicaid expansion financing terms are shifted. One more thing that's under active discussion on Capitol Hill right now, and this may be the most near-term threat because it polls very well, I think in part because people don't realize the full implication of it, is that there are aggressive proposals to add work requirements to Medicaid, essentially to require people who do not access Medicaid via the SSI pathway or another disability eligibility pathway, to find employment in order to stay on Medicaid. We actually have a fair amount of research showing that work requirements in Medicaid do not actually increase employment. They do not actually result in substantial benefits in terms of cost savings. What they do is kick large numbers of people off of the Medicaid program. So you do realize some cost savings there, but you do not realize cost savings, from improving the quality of people's care. You do not realize cost savings from people being more likely to be employed. In effect, this just creates a huge amount of administrative burden, in which a tremendous amount of resources go towards trying to track people, tremendous amount of resources go towards keeping people off of the Medicaid program. And you see a lot of people with disabilities impacted by this as well, because again, disability exemptions either only flow to persons receiving SSI or are very hard to get. So once again, I think these proposals for Medicaid work requirements stand to really harm the disability community as well.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Joanne. We appreciate your broad understanding of health and education policy, how all the tapping into all the different pieces of the landscape of what's happening, the implications for people with disabilities. And I also appreciate the discussion about what's reality about the quality and efficiency of these programs, despite how they might be framed in the news, and starting to get into those macro ways that people have started fighting back. So before we dive into some of the questions from the participants, we have one more kind of question for both of you that is probably on most of your minds, but what can we do? How can people follow policy developments? What can disability advocates consider when sharing information? What are some effective advocacy strategies? Any insight into how people in this room could move forward with this information would be helpful. And everyone, please keep posting your questions in the Q&A, and we'll start compiling those after this section.
So just putting my personal hat on for a bit. One strategy that I personally have been using has been has been calling my legislators in a way that I never have before. I mean, I've always sort of picked, okay, here's an issue, and I will make a call about a particular thing. Since January 28th, when the funding for my organization at least briefly went down, I've been calling my both of my senators and my state representative every single weekday. It's mostly been on disability issues. I pick different issues, different days. But this is the contact your legislators piece is just a vital thing that that can be that we can leverage. I mean, these folks work for us. I mean, that's how this democracy is structured. However wobbly it might be at this point, that's still what we're operating under. And so I will, I'll drop a couple of links into the chat that involve scripts on a couple of the issues that I talked about. The Department of Education overall, I noticed that the script today has been updated with the fact that there's an executive order coming down. The other one I'll drop in is about the lawsuit, and it would be a call to the Attorney General if you're in a state that has joined the lawsuit that is seeking to make Section 504 unconstitutional. There's a script for that. I would also encourage you to, whatever organizations you're participating with that have, that are working on the disability issues important to you. I'm thinking of Autism Society chapters, Autism Self-Advocacy Network, the ARC. They're just whatever disability organization that you're already connected with, get on the mailing list, check their website. They may well have scripts for you to make the calls as well. I mean, you can always write your own story, and write out your own call. And I don't want to discourage that, but that does seem to be the place where folks often kind of hit the wall on, oh my goodness, how am I going to write this thing down? How am I going to talk to my legislator when I call? A couple of thoughts about that. I mean, you're not going to talk to your legislator when you call. It's you're most likely going to talk to an answering machine, a voicemail. And that kind of relieves the pressure for some folks. And I've been finding if I talk too long and I get to the end of that I get to the end of the message and they cut me off, and they give me a chance to record it again. I can do it again. And if you want to be sure that you're talking to a recording, call off hours. That recording counts just as much as calling on hours. I think that that's the piece that is easiest for me to sort of share in terms of individual advocacy. And just a little bit more about I'm talking a lot about phone calls because those are it's the most immediate way to sort of get what's happening on the other end is often the staffer will just be making a check mark, protect Medicaid. Okay, I got another call about protecting Medicaid. I got another call about protecting Medicaid. I got another call about, yes, dismantle the Department of Education. No, don't. And they're making the check marks. And the issues that get a lot of calls are going to be elevated to, oh goodness, the public opinion is running really strong this way. So it does make a most immediate difference. I think emails tend to get a little bit less attention. Written letters, while once they get in, might be a little bit more attention to them. They get caught up in what's the word? Making sure they don't have anthrax in them, right? The security protocols. It's going to take longer for your mail message to get there. So it's your representatives that you'd want to is the place to put calling other states representatives is less so unless they've got a particular committee assignment. Yeah, okay. So I did, and I forgot to set my timer on myself, so I may be running a little bit long. But um,
No, I
the
think
yeah, as far
so.
as
Go ahead.
staying okay, as far as staying on top of things, I have been. I think I mentioned before my Facebook, my Blue Sky. I mean, and whatever newspapers. I think following ProPublica, Wired, Wired magazine. My goodness, has sort of jumped out as being very on top of the things of the administration. Yeah, and I do want to encourage. I see in the chat people are putting things in. Yeah, let's make this a crowdsource, okay? Because I'll put in a couple of things, but this is something we can crowdsource because I bet folks are doing things on their own that are really exciting. Okay, I'll turn it over to Ari now.
No, I think you captured it exactly, Joanne. So I won't reiterate your points regarding making phone calls and signing up for the mailing lists of national disability organizations. I would just say, wholehearted agreement. One small thing that I would add is there is more of a need than ever for state and local disability advocacy, and I would say there are two reasons for that. One is, if we see some of these adverse policies go through, whether they're stripping back of legal rights or cuts of funding, being well positioned to try and restore some of those things, through state legislatures, and, to push states to pick up where the federal government, has stepped back is going to be really important. We're not going to be successful at doing it. All over, and we're not going to be successful doing it, to the same degree, because the federal government has access to resources, state governments do not. So we really need to fight for federal funding, but we also do need to be prepared to fight at the state level, regardless of what happens in Washington. And then second, at a practical level, state and local disability advocacy groups can, in many respects, be more influential on federal legislators, than just, single individuals. Don't get me wrong, you should be making your phone calls. You should be absolutely, communicating as individuals to your member of Congress. But there's also a lot of power in a member of Congress knowing that in their district or in their state, there is a group of people who are deeply concerned about a specific set of issues, be those issues be Medicaid, home and community-based services, or 504 rights, or a whole host of other things. So I wholeheartedly endorse everything Joanne said about making phone calls, getting involved with national disability organizations. But don't sleep on the need for investing, locally as well, because we really need those on the ground state and local advocates, to be organizing and to be prepared, both for putting pressure on federal legislators, but also for fights to come, which may emerge in state capitals across the country if these cuts and rollbacks do go through.
Thank you both. Those were some really concrete and helpful tips and resources. So let's dig right into some of these questions. One of the first ones we had was concerns about potential threats to Olmstead in addition to Section 504. And for any of these questions, I know we kind of broke it up into, Aria's health and Joanne has education, but feel free, of course, for either of you to jump in on any of this. So
So
any,
that,
go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead. So there's absolutely a threat to Olmstead. The litigation that 17 state attorney generals have brought challenging the constitutionality of 504 and the recent Section 504 regulations actually specifically references language in the 504 regulations regarding Olmstead. So there are multiple dimensions of that. They're challenging language in the 504 regulations, indicating that people should be able to assert rights under Olmstead if they're at serious risk of institutionalization, which is really important. You shouldn't have to wait till you're actually in an institution, in order to assert rights under Olmstead. But they're also just going after the 504 statute's constitutionality as a whole, which has implications for Olmsted. 504 has also had a longstanding integration mandate in its regulations, and it's generally been interpreted the same way as the ADA's integration mandate, which is the foundation for Olmsted. There are a lot of areas, in which that could potentially be really impactful and important, such as addressing the hospital to nursing home pipeline, where hospitals will routinely discharge patients with disabilities to nursing homes for post-acute care when they would otherwise support people to find a home health agency, and a whole host of other integration implications. These are things that, because 504 applies to any entity that receives federal funds, 504 is particularly useful for in ways that the ADA, which has a slightly different scope, is less useful for. So I would say that Olmsted is very much on the line. What you can do about that is, if you live in one of those 17 states, and Joanne I think we have a link. Did I? Yeah, Joanne has put a link in the chat, which I think lists the 17 states in question. Yes, they do. If you live in one of those 17 states, you should contact your state attorney general and say you want them to remove themselves from this litigation. The state AGs are saying, well, we don't want to attack 504. We're just focused on some minor components related to the regulation. It's not true. If you read the actual litigation, if you read the actual complaint, they are claiming that 504 is unconstitutional, and they are specifically targeting Olmsted. So if you are in one of these states, I just posted the list of states in the chat, you have a very important job to do. That's contacting your attorney general and say, get off this lawsuit. Not tomorrow, not next week, not a month from now, today, because it really is quite important.
And I'm going to stay in my education lane here. And wonderful answer, Ari. Thank you.
Great. So next question, I'll paste this in the chat for you both, but if you have any idea on what might happen to the Rehabilitation Services Administration within the Department of Ed that administers vocational rehabilitation VR services.
It's very hard to say. There have been proposals for years to move RSA into the Department of Labor. It's not the worst idea in the world, honestly. In the grand scheme of things, I probably wouldn't put that in my top five concerns about the elimination of the Department of Education, but there are some potential problems that might emerge out of it. The last time this was proposed, about 10 years ago, in discussions under WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, ultimately was rejected, and the decision was made to keep it in the Department of Education because there was an active desire to see vocational rehabilitation services coordinated with special education services for transitioning youth. I think one thing that I would be really worried about regarding the splitting up of RSA and OSERS, the broader Office of Special Education and Rehab Services, would be, if you see a situation, as we might see, where Office of Special Education Programs goes to the Department of Justice and the Rehabilitation Services Administration goes to the Department of Labor. I think you'd see a lot less emphasis on trying to get voc rehab agencies to support transitioning youth with disabilities. So, RSA is not in my top five concerns, but I think there are some potential harms that could come out of that.
And again, I'm learning about this piece right now. So thank you.
Great, thank you both. So there's a question from Meg in the Q&A that they talk about how they're working on a project focusing on helping the social work community understand the policy proposals in Project 2025 and their implications for different marginalized populations. So they're organizing affinity discussion groups, and there's been a question about whether they should have one specific to disability issues or infuse disability related issues into each group. And they wondered if either of you had advice. And I think that's a broader question about kind of siloing the disability related advocacy issues or infusing in with other groups. So, any response to that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, my initial thought with that would be that, life infuses disability related issues into everything. The trick is to stay on top of that and do enough of that to make it, to make it real. I certainly see both sides of it, and maybe this is a both and. You have a disability group and you infuse the disability issues into the other groups too, because there's so often a danger that disability issues, if you silo them, then stay in their silo. When in fact, there's, the intersectionality is just, is a part of how we live this. My take.
So I'll maybe give a somewhat complementary, somewhat contradictory perspective. I actually think there's a strong argument for trying to do both. Um, you know, uh, eh, we do want to see disability infused throughout every single area. It is also simply a reality that the social connotations of disability are very different from the social connotations of other marginalized groups. And we see that right now, with the fact that despite all of these attacks, the truth is the disability community is not as targeted as, say, the trans community is, or some other marginalized communities are. And a big part of that is simply because there is a lot more crossover appeal to disability in American politics than there are to other marginalized groups. Less so than there once was. The bipartisan consensus on disability isn't what it once was, 30, 40 years ago. But it exists to a far greater extent than, say, questions of civil rights on the basis of race, ethnicity, or, LGBTQ status, or other dimensions of marginalization. So there's a question of what you do with that, right? One argument is, that you can kind of foreground disability in broader arguments about shared policy priorities. And a lot of that is, I think, what's happening right now in the discussions regarding the Department of Education. It's the reason why the impacts on disabled children are being put front and center by broader civil rights groups because they know a lot of Republican voters are more likely to care about, harms to disabled children than they are going to be likely to care about harms to low-income children from the elimination Department of Education. You can also, make an argument that, there are contexts in which there are disability-specific items that may not get the attention that they need, and in which disability may not be adequately foregrounded, because they aren't really shared priorities. They're really more specific to people with disabilities, at least to some extent, unless disability is being organized around specifically. And I think I would put home and community-based services in that category. I would put a few other things that are really disability-specific programs. So what I would say is I would want to see people with disabilities and disability policy expertise in both the general group conversations, recognizing that that's where you're going to say, hey, disabled people are impacted by the elimination of the Department of Education, but I would also want to see some kind of dedicated space for, thinking about disability specific priorities like HCBS. And just bluntly, I don't think it's a bad thing for disability to maintain a distinct brand, one that works in coalition with other marginalized groups, but, also recognizes that we may be one of the last places of crossover appeal in American politics today. And there's power there, and we should be ready to use it on others' behalf and on our own behalf, too.
Great. Thank you both so much. I agree. Excellent advice. we have a lot of questions coming in, and we're going to be conscious of time. So I'm pasting another one in there that I think is helpful in terms of advocacy. It seems like litigation is an increasingly important tactic. Do you see a role for advocacy organizations or provider organizations in bolstering that as a tactic if they haven't before?
Joanne, this is definitely you coming from PNA.
Coming from the PNA. Yeah, although I'm coming from the PNA, but I'm working sort of within a smaller section that doesn't, I'm not the one who is in the deciding kind of roles about the about where does the protection and advocacy, both on the national level and on the state level, where do we best jump in? I can say those conversations are happening, and and I there's some pretty strong opinion that that there should be that our organizations should be playing a role. The question is how the question is determining what that role should be and where do we fit in. And I think that every organization, and I mean, not just the PNAs, but any organization, whether they have or have not been involved in litigation before, should be there's some questions to be thinking about. If if the thing that is happening is specific to what your organization is doing, can you are there other entities that are working on that and about to litigate on that you can jump into? So from the PNA, from the disability rights organization perspective, this is it's been a little bit more our bread and butter, and again, we're as state organizations, we're taking some cues from the national level, and that's about as far as as far as I can speak for my organization on this.
Ari, do you want to jump in at all?
Let's just use the time for one last question.
That sounds like a great idea. There are so many good questions in here. It's hard to, I'm choosing kind of randomly to hope that we get as many people's answers. This one at the top is, this individual talks about how they're a Medicaid policy wonk whose work is federally funded. Personally, they're a parent of a young adult with Prader-Willi syndrome. They're struggling with significant moral distress. Do they stay in the work and make compromises based on this administration's policy priorities, hoping to still do some good, or do they try to get out and leave them in it? Do you have advice on kind of managing that moral distress and that compromise, and figuring out where to draw the line as individuals and organizations? That's a very deep question, but I think it's something that many of us are struggling with. So any advice that you have?
That is a deep.
Max, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You go. No, Ari, you go first.
Max Weber referred to the idea of politics as entailing an ethic of responsibility, which is to say, the positions you take, or that you espouse aren't as important as the things you get done. And I think, what I take away from that is that, nobody gets anything done in politics without, finding themselves, in a place where they sometimes feel very icky and, have dirty hands. But, we can do really important and impactful things by staying in this work. And especially when it comes to Medicaid, which, frankly, is the whole ball game as far as people with disabilities are concerned, or at least 85, 90% of the ball game. We need smart, committed, values-driven people. The disability rights movement's greatest asset throughout its history has been this concept called the hidden army. Many disabled people, family members of disabled people, people care about disabled people in positions of influence, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes medium, that can make their voices heard at crucial moments. So I don't know exactly what position you're in and, the many different Medicaid bureaucracies there exist out there, but I would encourage you to stick with it. I know it's hard, But we really do need your voice. We really do need your engagement, especially when it comes to Medicaid. I'll say, and this may not be the most romantic note to end on, but it's very true. Reason why Medicaid is so important is the same reason why John Dillinger robbed banks. Once asked John Dillinger, why do you rob banks? And he answered, well, because that's where the money is. We need people fighting to save Medicaid. We need people fighting for good Medicaid policy because that is the financial backbone upon which the entirety of the disability service system is financed. So that is absolutely critical, and we appreciate your continued voice, knowing how hard it is.
My goodness, and I'm not sure I should. I'm not sure I should add anything to that because that was such a wonderful, rousing way to just sort of end your remarks there, Ari. I appreciate that very much. I would just be one thing I would add is that I have that the question of moral harm, moral injury in this kind of thing is I've been seeing it talked about more openly now than ever before. And I think that there are other folks who are dealing with that out there, and that may be that seeking out some of those conversations may be a resource for you, whatever you decide. I want to be cheerleader too and say stay with it. But I also want to encourage folks to do what they can and know what they can't. And it's a very personal decision. Would love to see you stay with it, but do take care of yourself, whatever you decide.
Thank you both. I think that was the perfect question to end on. Ari and Joanne, we cannot thank you enough for agreeing to do this for us and your time and your expertise. I think we all learned so much from you both. And as a reminder, this webinar is recorded, and we will upload it just like our other webinars to the Policy Impact Project website. If there are any other topics that people would like to see lunch series on, please let us know. We're trying to be as responsive to the community as possible. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.